Hi, everybody. So, schedule continues to conspire against all attempts to get as many of these chapters done in orderly fashion as possible. I'm going to elaborate on that more in a later video. Excuse me, but not today. So, I will be. Oh, brief moment here. I need a test to make sure the audio is actually working. Yeah, okay. Sorry. I will be explaining sort of what's been going on, kind of screwing with the schedule as we get a little closer to the end of the month. But today I'm going to have to leave in about 47 minutes for an appointment that my wife and I have to attend. So that means I'm going to read as much as I can in those 47 minutes, and then I'm going to scoot out of here. Hopefully that will be 2 chapters. Hopefully that'll be 3 chapters, but it'll definitely be 2. I already checked to see how long they were. So, jumping into chapter 19, this is the start of the preparations for the attack on the town of Delmore, where everybody except Gandrath, Ghost, and Trem are in an attempt to protect those people from the invasion of the Broken. So, chapter 19. Delmore was a hive of activity. Things were moving so swiftly they might have seemed chaotic, but this was an organized turmoil. Diaga Corsair was hustling people into wagons along with all the possessions they needed. He positioned himself with a few of the elder men of the town at the end of the wagon train and dispensed orders to the men, women, and children as they passed by. Diaga had been giving direction for over 3 hours, and he was tired but remained determined. His experience as an orphan had led Diaga to feel that if people experienced even a minor kindness, they would then learn to do the same for others. Besides, these people had no one to guide them. By remaining with them and directing their efforts to escape the coming assault, Diaga felt he was passing on a lesson of courage and charity in the face of doom. The work also served to keep his mind off the fracturing of their little band of travelers. The departure of Trem confused him deeply, and he found that in the rare idle moments he had, he inevitably puzzled at the causes of Trem's peculiar actions. Diaga had not learned precisely what transpired between Jovanaleth and this man, Joseph, but the more he pondered the old man's reaction to Trem, the more things had begun to make sense. Diaga understood from the beginning that Trem was unique. The mage's experiences with the arcane had lent him a sixth sense for all kinds of oddities. From the beginning he had suspected there was more to Trem than there appeared to be. But not until encountering Joseph had Diaga started to wonder how unusual the half-elf actually was. It was impossible for Trem to have known Joseph almost 30 years ago, even taking into account his elven blood, which would have prolonged his youth and lifespan. Trem could not be a day over 30 now, based on his appearance. Yet, somehow, he had helped Joseph in a predicament similar to the current one. This had brought all sorts of strange ideas to Diaga's mind, but also raised arguably more significant questions. How old was Trem really, and why did he appear untouched for the passage of time since his Nagalan? But even an explanation for that oddity would not entirely clarify Trem's sudden departure. It was an action taken out of fear and doubt, or perhaps a selfish sense of preservation. Trem had sworn to help Jovanaleth, that much Diaga understood. And yet, when he learned Jovan wanted to risk himself for people in need, Trem had abandoned his friend for the more logical, if heartless, path south. There was a large piece of this story missing, and Diaga was determined to uncover it if he was given time. For now, all he could do was worry about living through this ordeal and getting as many others out of Delmore with him as he could. That Jovanaleth was conflicted over Trem's departure was obvious. Logan seemed convinced that the young prince had a death wish, and he appeared to have accepted this with a soldier's dutiful understanding. Diaga was not willing to allow such a misguided nobility to go unquestioned. Whatever foolish belief led Logan to think Jovan's sacrifice was in some way right was one he disagreed with completely. Jovan should not be allowed to pursue his suicidal defense of the North Wall simply to make a point about the value of ideals in the face of death. The wizard thought that it would make more sense to give Jovan enough time to realize that Trem's betrayal had less to do with their relationship than it did with outside circumstances, and to understand that dying would in no way undo the hurt he felt at watching his friend turn his back on them all. Diaga had advocated removing Jovanaleth from the dangerous northern barrier in favor of a more experienced warrior, but Logan had insisted that if Jovanaleth wanted to be there, he could not and should not be stopped. Grimtooth had merely shrugged his shoulders. Only Diaga seemed to believe Jovan was risking his life in a futile attempt to prove something to an absent Trem. Diaga had his own responsibilities to worry about, though. Thoughts of the others only briefly passed through his mind, as he had little time to think beyond handing out orders to the people of Delmore. As they moved swiftly past him, he, or a militia member, would stop a man or woman and direct them to return some unnecessary item or to hurry along with the rest of their family. They discouraged multiple trips back to the home because Diaga feared it would make the families determined to stay and cling desperately to the familiar. He well understood their desire to hole up where they were comfortable, but he also knew that they would die if they did not leave. Neep was of no small assistance. Being an animal herself, she had a great affinity with the horses and oxen being used to pull the carts and wagons. Her confidence that Diaga would not leave his post allowed her to wander down the line and help calm the beasts so that the process of loading them became easier. Many of the people seemed wary of the large orange cat with a menacing sword, but they seemed to have accepted her as a friend for the moment. Diaga watched her during a lull as she held and stroked one of the horses' heads, and was surprised at the emotion it solicited in him. He had known Neep for a large portion of his life, and had always simply expected her to be there when he turned around. He was so accustomed to it that he realized he could not envision life without her. In fact, the thought scared him. Diaga's revelry was interrupted by the necessities of his duty. He halted a farmer carrying a large sack of wheat grain on his back. "Sir, I'm sorry, but you can't bring that. We have enough supplies to last a few weeks, but we simply can't wear down the animals with too much weight." The man did not acknowledge Diaga, but in compliance he turned to move back to his home. Diaga stopped a mother with several bundles containing clothes and told her to leave them. "We'll get you some new ones once we're out of danger." He attempted a friendly smile and got no response, but she dropped the sacks. Diaga sighed. He wished Logan, with his charismatic demeanor and proud presence, was doing this job instead of him. He simply did not know how to connect with people he'd never met. A small tug at his robes brought Diaga's attention to his left. A young boy, hardly 5 summers, was sucking in his thumb and looking imploringly at him with a small sackcloth bear tucked under one arm. Diaga crouched down low with a genuine smile to reach eye level with his young visitor. "Hello there. What's your name?" The boy did not respond, but simply sucked his thumb and stared at Diaga. The mage tried another ploy. "Is that your bear?" The boy nodded. "Does he have a name?" That brought the thumb out of his mouth. "Cole." "Cole. So he's a black bear, then?" The boy nodded again. "He's a nice bear, though." Diaga smiled. "I'm sure he is. Is there something I can do for you and Cole?" The boy looked quite seriously at him. "Will you really save us from the bad ones?" Diaga's smile disappeared, and he put a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "I won't let anything happen to you, or Cole." The boy seemed to feel that decided things. "Okay, thanks, mister." "Diaga," the young man said. "You can call me Diaga." "Thanks, Mr. Diaga." Diaga looked around. "Where are your parents? You should get into a cart." The boy stuck his thumb back in his mouth and spoke around it. "I don't have parents anymore." Diaga was struck dumb. It took him a moment to realize he was just staring at this young chub before he pulled himself together. "Well then, how about I take you to one of the carts? I'll find you another nice boy to sit with." The child nodded and put his hands up. Diaga hoisted him into his own arms and was stunned to realize how small the boy actually was. He turned and began walking down the line of carts, and as they walked, the boy tapped his shoulder. "Yes?" "Mr. Diaga, my name's Samuel. Samuel Jovian. Nice to meet you, Samuel." "You too, Mr. Diaga." Diaga kept walking. When he found the cart he wanted, he realized Samuel was asleep with his head on his shoulder. He was bewildered, unsure what to do. Fortunately, the priestess of Endoth, Kaliandra, was there with another child, slightly younger than Diaga's little friend, and smiled at him. "I can take him." The living warmth in his arms had mesmerized Diaga, and his reaction was delayed. "What's that?" Oh, yes, thank you, miss." She smiled again as he gently passed Samuel to her. "No, my lord, thank you." Diaga blushed, muttering almost to himself, "I'm no lord, priestess, just someone trying to help." "Well, that makes you better than a lord already. Bless you, sir, and your friends." Diaga did not know what to say, so he simply nodded and made a gesture that might have been a wave and walked back to his post. The guards were still stopping the odd member of the town. For the most part, it seemed things had finally been prepared. Diaga nodded to one of the guards just as Jovan came running with his bow out and strung. "We spotted them. They're a half-mile up on the hill, spreading out. No idea when they'll attack." Diaga glanced at the sun. "What time is it?" he asked the nearest guard. "Almost noon, my lord," he replied. Diaga looked at Jovan. "Soon, then," the ranger said. "I should get back to Joseph." He began to hurry up, but Diaga called after him. "Joveneleth!" He stopped, and Diaga found he wasn't sure what he should say, so he said the first thing that came to mind. "Be careful. All right, friend?" Jovan looked at him confused, then seemed to understand and nodded. He was gone a moment later. Neep came up next to Diaga and leaned slightly on him. Diaga absently stroked her fur and dismissed the militia assisting him with a wave of his hand. He looked at his companion and smiled, though it felt rather forced. "Well, Neep, I always said I wanted to have adventures. Come on, I need to study my spells in solitude before things get too dangerous." The two wandered to the eastern side of town to find a suitable home for Diaga to meditate in. At the western gate, Logan and Grimtooth were still directing construction of their barrier. The huge orc was wearing only his wolfskin kilt and hefted massive planks and tables from nearby homes with frightening ease, carrying them with a steady pace to set across the entrance. The townspeople hurriedly used smaller planks to bind the larger ones together under Logan's careful direction. They had accepted Grimtooth's presence slowly, but his good humor and incredible strength of will won them over. Their fear subsided for the most part, and some even offered him a hand with the heaviest pieces. Logan had shed his armor and was directing the placement of the defenses shirtless, in the gathering shadows of the dark clouds. If it rained, it would work in the favor of the defenders by making the ground muddy and slick, but it would also hide their opponents and dampen the bowstrings of the archers. Logan had a team of men busily digging up the soil outside the barricade as far out as they could to create a mud pit in the event the rain started before the attack. For the first time in all his years as a soldier, the knight found himself in charge, and was not particularly fond of it. He was a warrior, but not a leader. Logan had always inspired through his actions and not his direction. His moment of bravado on the cart had been more a mere expression of his beliefs, not an attempt to assume command. In the back of his mind, Logan also wished Trem were there with him. Even Ghost, or Greymaned Squall, as he supposed he should be called, would have been a welcome presence. He knew that Ghost had, under his former name and title, commanded armies before, and there seemed every hint that Trem had combat experience as well. Logan had taken up this mantle because he felt he ought to, but he was uncomfortable and awash in self-doubt. He knew that at the very least, the two knew how to handle themselves in a fight, and right now, he could use all the fighters available. Moreover, he'd grown to like the half-elf, and if he was being honest, even the strange events when they had reached Delmore had not changed that. Trem's flight from the town had not permanently tarnished his image in Logan's mind, because he could at least see the logic in the decision. Logan had trouble accepting Trem's choice to leave Jovan behind more than anything else. To take the more practical road, particularly when one was not bound by duty to remain, was sound reasoning, but to toss aside a friend whom one had sworn to aid at the first sign of danger was unthinkable. He recalled his conversation with Diaga, who had expressed great concern for Javanaleth. Jovan was with them, and he was in danger, and he most certainly seemed to have a strong desire to risk his life and limb to prove that this venture was worth undertaking. Logan had seen this sort of thing before among young Ungdaics, a desire to fight in the most dangerous places to prove their devotion to the cause. He suspected Jovan was trying to prove to Trem just how worthwhile this fight was, and it was a motivation Logan recognized and felt had value. Diaga had shaken his head at that reasoning. He had asked how anything could be proven to a man who was not even there, and what possible purpose taking such brash risks could serve. Logan replied it did not matter if Trem were there because the doubt had been sown in Jovan, and so it was in him that the faith must be found to keep going. Diaga merely insisted Javanaleth wouldn't be going anywhere if he died. Standing there amidst the chaos of the preparations, Logan had blocked out this thought. In leading this desperate rescue, he had decided that he must become more like his brother. Varasha was calculating and harshly logical. There was no point in risking many lives to save one. Logan must accept that Javanaleth was choosing to endanger himself of his own accord, and that, as the leader of this effort, it was his duty to use what time the young man would buy him to save as many innocent lives as possible. Grimtooth was well aware of what his blood brother was doing, and he disapproved. While the orc did not dislike Varasho, he much preferred Logan. This act of detachment was not like his blood brother. War was a naturally emotional state, and even though those who removed themselves seemed to succeed more often than not, this time it struck him as wrong. There would be young men dying here this day, well before their time. Their passing should be avenged and, if possible, guarded against. This was an act of love in the orc's eyes. It was love of these people and regret for their predicament that had made Grimtooth stay, and he would fight to the death for nothing more than the blind faith in standing up for those who lacked the strength to defend themselves. It seemed a betrayal for his brother to detach himself from the internal struggle of Javanaleth, a struggle that was causing the young man to place himself at the forefront of the maelstrom descending on them all. Hefting yet another table from the nearby inn, Grimtooth kindly turned down the help of a young boy who attempted to take hold with him. It was surprising to the orc that the youthful gravitated towards him more easily than the elders. Grimtooth speculated that perhaps it was because they had not experienced enough of the harshness of the world to distrust people based on their appearance. The elders of the town had come round to him slowly, but the distance remained. These young people, though, somehow they saw through it all. Logan had once told them, back when they were in Alderlast, that this was the innocence of youth. Grimtooth wished the world had a bit more of their accepting attitude. The orc marched down the line of the makeshift wall with the massive table on his broad shoulders. At the end, a crew of men waited with small planks and nails to bind it with the rest. They had nearly finished the barrier. One more table would likely cover the whole gap. Grimtooth dropped the heavy wooden mass into position and held it there for men to seal in place, and then he made his way back to Logan. The knight was conferring with one of the townspeople. The man was nodding again and again, until finally Logan sent him on his way. Grimtooth approached his blood brother and handed him a wineskin filled with clear water. The orc downed it in one gulp while Logan talked. I told them to add some planks from the lumber yard to the barrier in a vertical fashion so the wall's a bit higher. I'm afraid I'll need you to carry some of the long benches from the inn behind the wall. That way our archers can shoot over it from a covered position. Grimtooth wiped his mouth. Aye, sounds like a fine plan. Mayhaps we should tell young Javanaleth to do the same. Logan nodded. I already sent a messenger to him. Grimtooth eyed his brother. You know the lad be in grave danger. Logan stared straight ahead. I know. And you also know we should be looking out for him. I do. Grimtooth sighed. Well, then how do you propose we do that, Logan? The knight looked at his towering companion. He's with Joseph, and I trust that man. For now we have to rely on him. Fetch me those benches, Grimtooth, and send some other people to bring a few to Jovan as well. Grimtooth stared at his brother a bit longer, then nodded. Aye. Logan watched him go. In his mind, he began to form the orchestration of the defense. They would need to coordinate it perfectly in order to make everything work, but if they did, it would save many lives. He surveyed the construction of his barrier quietly until he noticed the messenger he had sent was standing next to him at attention. Logan turned around and made a gesture of apology, but before he could speak, the man blurted out, "They've been spotted, Sir Logan. Lord Javaneleth saw them from his position. They're spreading about the surrounding hills." Logan digested this calmly. "It'll take them some time to position themselves. Send word to Javaneleth I want him to meet me in the center of town. Have someone else hurry to find the wizard, Diaga. We must converse before they attack. Hurry now." The messenger rushed off to convey his information. Logan called out to the workers to hurry along and arm themselves once the job was done. He left Grimtooth in charge and told him to meet him at the junction of the west and north roads as soon as he could. Logan retired to a nearby house to arm himself. He pulled on his beautifully engraved steel armor and carefully tested and retested each leather strap. Logan considered putting on his heavy riding helm, but thought the better of it. He would need his peripheral vision once the fighting began, and he would sacrifice the added protection to preserve it. Logan took out his heavy sword and twirled it a few times, feeling the elegant balance. He held it before him and traced the fine carvings in the blade with his eyes, marked the dual blood channels, and then sheathed it and stepped outside. Grimtooth was waiting, battle axe in hand and wearing his leather chest straps. Logan eyed his bristling collection of throwing axes and knives before nodding. The two started a slow walk toward the center of town. After only a few strides, they heard the roar of thunder overhead, and the sky opened up into a steady rain. Grimtooth glanced beside him, and Logan half smiled. "Well," he remarked, "at least we can be sure it's raining on them, too." Grimtooth chuckled. "Aye, that'd be for sure." Jovan watched the army on the hills with growing apprehension. He had lived through his people's wars with the Broken when they attempted to siege Bladeholm, but this was something far different. Then he had been in a walled central castle within a city, only rushing out to fight when the bulk of the enemy had broken on that heavy stone bulwark. Now he was no longer distanced from the initial fury of an assault by a fearsome wall. Instead, he was the first line of defense behind a rickety wooden barrier. Jovan had not dared to tell the others that he had only been in live combat a scant number of times, and how his last real fight had ended poorly just before he met Trem. That had been a mere skirmish compared to this. In the inn at Gailakill, he had barely done anything. Trem had saved them, and now Trem had abandoned them. At that thought, Jovan's anger rose boiling to the surface. To have been forsaken by a man he trusted at the drop of a hat. The conversation with Joseph had done him some good, but he could still not comprehend Trem's departure, or his apparent alignment with Ghost and his deplorable sentiments. The two had seemed complete opposites in terms of doctrine, and their unification had been stunning. Javaneleth supposed he had trusted Trem too quickly. He had no basis to expect heroics from him. As Trem had alluded to, they had just been words. Yet the thought that he had saved his life would not dissipate either. Jovan knew he would be dead if it were not for Trem's healing in Silverleaf Forest. He also thought they might have all died in that inn without his strange sword coming to their aid, regardless of how he'd acquired it. But that same weapon supported the theory of Trem's dubious past. Jovan did not believe Trem's account, so where would he have acquired the sword of Vakhtyn el Vak, the most hated man in western Lagotia? It was possible the creature leading the attack on the inn was mistaken when it had named its previous owner the Blade, but Jovan thought it was unlikely given his own familiarity with the weapon's history. So this man he had had the foolishness to call a friend was quite possibly something else altogether. After all, Trem was following a man both Diaga and Logan had identified as the traitor of Nepal City. How could someone follow Ghost and not fear a knife in the back, or involvement in a scheme of dubious motivations? Jovan shook his head violently. These thoughts, they were clouding his mind. He needed to be focused on the task at hand. He could see the horde of broken soldiers massing on the surrounding hills. Javaneleth knew all too well what they would do once they were inside. His duty was to hold them off as long as possible. Trem be damned. Joseph leaned on his bow beside him. Despite many of his reservations about a man who seemed to think Trem was of vast importance, Javaneleth liked Joseph. This was a man much like his own father, a warrior by trade, a constant combatant, and a wise one. Jovan thought he would have fitting quite well at his home. Joseph surveyed the construction of their barrier with a practiced eye, stressing the reinforcement of certain areas and the necessity of height. Jovan simply nodded at these suggestions. There was no use pretending he knew more about warfare than the veteran. Unlike the wall of the west entrance, this one had been constructed with breadth in mind. The thickness was essential to maintaining its strength and would also serve to slow the invading army. Joseph had insisted on bales of dry hay being placed inside the wooden furniture, making up the majority of the wall. In this way, he hoped they might be able to set the barrier alight quickly when it looked as though the enemy was ready to break through. Jovan eyed the sky and wondered how well this plan would work when the rain came. Almost as if in answer to his thoughts, he heard a boom of thunder and it started to drizzle at a soft but steady pace. Jovan eyed Joseph askance and the old man simply shrugged, reading his thoughts. Well, it might still burn if the hay stays dry. Jovan didn't respond. He watched the crews hurriedly adding some height to the outer edge of the barrier. Joseph tapped his shoulder and he turned to see several men approaching with benches. Jovan eyed them quizzically and the lead man spoke. So Logan suggested you use these for your archers to shoot over the wall. Jovan nodded and the man continued. He also asked that you meet him in the junction of the west and north roads. He said the others are waiting. Jovan nodded again, almost as if not hearing. Joseph patted his arm. Go, young man, I can manage here for a while. Realizing he had no excuse to delay, Javaneleth shouldered his bow and started to the town center. Joseph watched him go with a small sigh. He was an old man. These young people came and went in his lifetime, and he was powerless to stop it. Eventually, he had ceased trying. He had put down his sword and hidden in a small village far from the war, or so he thought. Perhaps only he understood how Trem really felt after what had happened 20-odd years ago. He knew why, because he had done the same thing. He had tried to hide here, but his past caught up with him yet again. The thought came to him again that Joseph was an old man, and to many he was a very old man. He had lived more than long enough already. In his earliest life, he made a living on his sword. He had killed so that he could go on living. Never had Joseph bothered to ask if it had done anyone any good. He was only fighting to serve himself. Later he had tried to make up for his misguided youth by taking up causes he thought were noble, only to learn of the gray lines between nobility and villainy. Here in Delmore, at this final stage in his life, he was wondering if he had ever done a decent thing for another human being, a single self-sacrificing act in his whole existence. It was so difficult for him to think of his last selfless decision that he had made a choice when he saw Trem and the others earlier that day. Joseph decided he would correct the selfishness of 70-odd years. Whatever happened, he would make sure this young man, Jovan, lived to see the next dawn. Jovan was, of course, oblivious to Joseph's thoughts, and may not have believed them had he known. He was within his own mind now. His walk was heavy, knowing this would be the final meeting with his companions before the battle began, that this might be the final time he'd see them again in this world. It was a sobering thought for an already drained young prince. Jovan was realizing now, for the first time in his life, exactly how lonely things could be. He hadn't made friends here, but he had other friends at home he had known his whole life. They were not here to help him, and he might die never seeing them again. He might never learn what had happened to his father. As he plodded slowly through the now muddying streets of Delmore, Javaneleth was overcome by the harsh reality of life as a would-be hero. If you wanted to help people, the price you paid was your own sense of independence. It was indeed a great irony that Javaneleth of the Blade had been notorious for trying to avoid any semblance of his duties to office as a prince. In fact, Jovan had departed Bladeholm in order to avoid the responsibility pushed upon him by the absence of his father. When younger, he had tried to prevent his behavior from reflecting poorly on his family, but now as an adult, he found he also did not want to take on the mantle of a leader of a great nation. He had feared the damage that a mistake could make, the lives ruined with a simple stroke of a pen. Yet at least in that prison one had a sense of home. This was not the life of an adventurer. On the road you lost the right to die among your friends and family. You could have been killed anywhere, at any time, and the facts of your passing might never make it home. But this dark thought was countered by what was, to Jovan, the moral purity of his actions. Jovan knew he was risking his own life to save others who did not deserve to die in a terrible invasion. There were young children in those wagons who would have a chance at life now because he was willing to give up his own. This was calming and allowed him to detach his fear and emotions from the events around him. Logan would have a plan that would help the people of this town, and Jovan would have an integral part in making certain that it worked. That kind of responsibility, newly foisted, he found he liked. Javaneleth had kept his eyes upon the muddy road of Delmore as he pondered his life up to the present. Now and then he lifted them and scanned the area around him. People were no longer hustling through the streets to retrieve their belongings. Delmore had reverted back to the town they had discovered when they first arrived. It was a corpse, a memory of a town. Jovan shouldered his bow and picked up his pace to reach Logan and the others more quickly. They were circling around a pile of stones and sticks in the middle of the junction. Logan, Grimtooth, Diaga, and Neep were all present. Jovan slowed and strolled into the circle with only a nod of acknowledgement. Logan got down to business immediately. This, he pointed at one of the sticks near the edge of the rocks, is the north entrance. And this is the west. The attack must come at once, at one or both of these points. Javaneleth surveyed the hodgepodge of items and realized they were a rough representation of Delmore itself. Logan continued, the primary assault will likely fall in the north entrance where Jovan and Joseph are situated. The distance from where we stand right now, and that point, is roughly twice the distance from the western entrance to here. What we expect is a focused attack to the north and a smaller, likely even a diversion attack, to the west. We will therefore use these distances and the expected intensity of the assaults to our advantage. The attackers will break through eventually. In fact, they will break through too quickly for us to give the people enough time to escape. Once within the town, they will have to be harried, ground given slowly, and the narrowness of their attack channel exploited. This means we must organize our men into units, preferably 3 different groups at each barrier. Each group will fight in a rotation, allowing the other groups to rest. They will defend in a stacked fashion, one group in front with a second supporting and a third out of action in the rear. Of course, we cannot expect the pattern to hold, but the longer it does, the more time we buy. The fighting retreat should be based upon need. We will not back down if we do not have to. Jovan, your unit will likely reach the center of town before mine. If you do, you must wait for us to join you. Jovan understood. If I retreat too quickly, you'll be surrounded. Correct. The plan is to unite our forces where we are standing right now, and then fall into the final stretch of road and gradually filter out men to join the people fleeing the town. We will have to try to buy them, at the very least, 2 hours. They are already leaving the town as we speak and are on the road, but they will not be able to travel far or at great speed. Joven looked at the knight. What do we do once we get beyond the town? Logan glanced at Diaga. That depends on whether our resident mage can open the entrance to the caverns. Gend is leading the others too. Diaga shrugged. I can unless Gend seals them permanently with some sort of spell or mystical item. If he wards the doors or even brings down the cavern entrance on a cave-in, it would be beyond my ability to open. If not, I'll need some time to decipher the stone locks. I've been reviewing my spells, and I took some time to study dwarven locks as well. They don't appear complicated. But if the cavern is sealed, Javanaleth asked, then we are going nowhere. There was a brief silence as the warriors considered the implications of that fact. Joven finally chuckled mirthlessly. Well, it's still better than waiting for them to come. Any plan beats no plan. Diaga smiled slightly. I do believe I have a few surprises for our foes as well. I have enough energy to heal the wounded for some time, but I might expend some in a more offensive manner if I find it necessary. I can help you as well. They turned to see Caliandra, having left her cart, walking to join them. I'm not a fighter, but a servant of the god of healing. I'll be among you, and will attempt to help those in need. Logan nodded curtly. Just be sure you both stay clear of the fighting. I don't want you getting injured trying to save someone else. Diaga locked eyes with the knight. Neep can protect me on Godaic. I'd be more concerned about myself if I were you. Grimtooth grunted. Aye, that be where I come in, saving Logan's arse. There was a genuine moment of mirth at the assembled defenders at Grimtooth's quip. Then they heard a horn blast from the north. It was echoed by more and more horns until the deafening sound mimicked the thunder overhead. As if in response, the rain came down all the harder. The company gave one another a last glance and made for their posts. Logan reached out and caught Joven's arm. Keep them outside the wall and in the mud pits as long as possible. That should slow them well enough. If you see any gnolls, send word. Joven nodded and swallowed hard as he'd forgotten about the gnolls. Logan was already turning to Diaga and Caliandra to inquire about the progress of the people of Delmore. Caliandra assured him she had seen them safely out the south entrance with a capable guard in the lead. Logan nodded, and he and Grimtooth made a hasty dash for their entrance. Diaga saw Joven watching him and waved. Joven returned the gesture, and then he was off and running to his post. Diaga watched him a moment longer, as though he meant to go after him. Then, along with Caliandra, he followed Logan's path to the west gate. That's 19. Go to 20. Should be able to get through this. The troubles of Delmore were far behind Ghost and his converts as they made their way south under the dark sky of the gathering storm. They had ridden for the most of the morning, and only slightly slackened their pace with the pouring rain. The former Napoleon was confident he had put enough distance between his new followers and their soft-hearted former companions. A part of him still understood the sacrifice that the Anglo-Daic had chosen to make and even agreed with it, but most of that remnant of conscience still within him had died much earlier. That sense of duty to the weak and defenseless was from an older version of himself he had long since shed. Ghost had personally seen the way in which selfless men were recognized. Their heroics were praised, but their actions received nothing but words. Deep within, he knew his single-minded attitude was a betrayal of the legacy of service that had marked the history of the Squall House, where honor was not measured in titles and gold, but in responsibility to the people. Ghost could hear his father's words echoing in his head, the stern voice telling him ambition was misplaced, that the gods would reward him with what was his due, and no more. Until the day he died, he should conduct himself as a man of the people, with their lives as his primary duty. Greymane Squall, the man Ghost had once been, had given up that sacred obligation in pursuit of one more selfish. His bargain with Hrothgar Conan had been meant to secure his place at the High Thane Rhaegar Holt's side for years to come, and put him in position to grow his family's fame. Instead, his attention had been drawn so far from his duty to his personal achievement that it had blinded him and cost him everything. Throughout all the tragedy he had brought upon his house, Ghost had remained arrogant and confident, qualities that are essential to any great military commander. What made this a poisonous mixture was the fact he did not possess the patience or patriotism that makes such men satisfied with the more fundamental duties of a soldier. Ghost had not loved the military, though he was gifted and talented in its necessities. He had adored power and the admiration of others. His betrayal had been short-sighted, only an attempt to further his sphere of influence and the legend of his family. What it had done instead was destroy any thought of fame or glory. Ghost had lost his family, whom he had never truly cared deeply for when he had them, but whom he discovered had meant the world to him once they were gone. This rending of his soul had shattered what had once been an unbreakable ego, and Ghost had not shed the poison of his ambition. He had merely added to it the venom of hatred and blind revenge. Those young men back in Delmore who had so valiantly stood to defend the innocent were in his mind inexperienced fools. Ghost had lived long enough to learn how fruitless such ventures were. Battles for what was right over what was practical left behind only bodies of brave and the forgotten. The only way to accomplish anything was to let these issues, which were not of immediate concern, pass you by. Permit the deaths of people who could not swing the tide if it bought you time to turn around and strike back. His strategy was single-minded, and its goals were to spill blood, not prevent it from being shed. Ghost was pleased to see that Tremont understood the uselessness of standing against impossible odds, the futility of martyrdom. Their former companions back in Delmore might make one grand stand, a valiant defense in the face of impossible odds, but the names would fade. The victors would be the ones who would carry on the legend of their deeds, and the fallen would become only footnotes in the great story of history. If there was anything Ghost had maintained in his transition from his past life, it was the fear of being forgotten. He hoped he could pass the importance of making one's mark on to the half-elf. Trem had once been one of those fools, those would-be martyrs, men who thought their sacrifice was worth more than living on and finding fame through careful selection of causes and battles. Ghost was learning this lesson now. People like Ghost and Trem had a gift for war. They could offer the world much more than a corpse killed by good intentions. If Trem proved to be the fighter he had been in the inn, he'd be a deadly ally. The two of them would accomplish great things, and Napoleon would be able to have his revenge in full. In Ghost's mind, the two were parts of the same creature, and that beast could channel its anger into a bloody rampage across all of Tethtenir. The brooding of Ghost's thoughts was balanced out by the silent agony of Trem's. He knew now what Garand Oakheart had tried to warn him of, this terrible choice. He had expected to feel relief having done what the spirit had suggested, but instead he felt only guilt and shame. How coldly he had dismissed the young de Vandeleth, the man who reminded him of all the good parts of himself. Jovan was a true innocent, if ever there was one. Trem was consoling himself with the repeated mantra that his one sword could not make that much of a difference in the slaughter to come. He knew how these brave stands for the defenseless played out. Everyone ended up dead, except him. Their suffering was terrible, but it would end. On the highest planes of his own madness, he felt certain he would not die, the torment's end would not come. The pain of living through another violent massacre was too much. Jovan would not follow Trem, and he could not remain long enough to convince him of the misplaced bravery of their desperate stand in Delmore. The realization that he cared about not just Jovan and the others, but Delmore and the people there, tried to penetrate the stalwart defenses of Trem's mind. It was repelled by the continuous notion of his fated hand in the deck of life. He had been foolish to follow Jovan in the first place. That Trem would think he could help a young man with such pure intent was laughable. Looking around at his remaining company, he knew he belonged in this rogues' gallery of betrayers and assassins. Gazing at the back form of Wrath, he began thinking perhaps they were not so different. In his mind, Wrath was most certainly a cold-hearted killer, though Trem admittedly had yet to see him take a life. Gend was a liar through and through, though otherwise harmless. Trem had lived long enough of his own lies to see the halflings were only to protect his ego. He could not see him harming anyone but himself with his deceit, yet he could not be certain. Ghost saw Trem's eyes studying the riders before him, and their empty look shook him, despite his resolve to treat this odd half-breed as nothing more than a mighty tool towards his own ends. Inside, he could still feel that nagging understanding that Trem was superior to him in a way that he could not decipher. Ghost suspected that Trem's strength would only be brought out if he wanted it to be, otherwise it would remain sheltered behind his denial of whatever was beneath the surface. Thankfully, buried was where he seemed to want to keep his authority. Ghost peered ahead through the driving rain, trying to see the rising rocky hills he knew they must be nearing. It was less than 12 miles from the town through the fringes of the Silverleaf Forest to the caverns, according to Gend. Ghost wanted to be there, and gone. The rain and his soaked clothes were starting to irritate him. "We'll need torches." Ghost nearly fell from his saddle in surprise, but Trem did not notice. He cast a dark glance at the half-elf who'd ridden up suddenly behind him, but Trem was staring ahead into the storm. Ghost took a moment to recall what he'd said. "Ah yes, torches. We will need those in the cavern, of course. I'm sure we can find some wood to bring inside with us where it can dry. Once we will be able to seal the entrance behind us, and our pace can slow a bit." Trem shot him a surprised glance. "Why seal the cavern? You know the army will be busy at Delmore. There's no reason to think they'll come here." Ghost grunted. "If those fools we were traveling with actually manage to get out of town alive, I don't want them coming on our heels. But if they're fleeing the army, they'll have nowhere else to go but the caves. They'll be trapped." Ghost snorted. "And whose fault is that, Trem? They were witless enough to stay in Delmore. They don't deserve to make it out." Trem snarled suddenly, deep in his throat like a wild beast. "You can't just leave people to die." Ghost reined in his horse and routed on Trem, a sneer on his haggard face. "Can't I, Trem? I already have, and so did you. You left them to die when you joined me on this journey south, and it was the right decision. You're no hero, half-elf. People will not write passionate stories about your kind or mine. No, we will be spoken of like dark specters haunting the night, and I, for one, will accept being remembered fearfully over being forgotten. I chose to leave them to their fate, and I will not falter once we reach our destination. But Trem was speechless. What Ghost was doing was akin to murder, cutting off the only possible escape for people he had only days ago asked to help him. But he was right. Trem had done the same thing. He had sentenced them to death as surely as if he'd swung his blade. His mind reeled. He had refused to stay because he had trusted the words of a being he thought had his interests at heart, but in doing so he would leave the others dead, and he alone, alive, in this guilt-riddled state. His decision for self-preservation had been as murderous as Ghost's made in order to bring about a deserved but brutal revenge on his enemies. Trem gritted his teeth in anger, for it seemed his choice had been more hateful even than the Napoleon's. Trem looked at Ghost anew, and his face widened in horror. Ghost saw the change and suddenly realized what the half-elf was thinking. "It's too late, fool. Don't throw your life away." Trem's countenance firmed, his eyes grew harder than steel, and Ghost found himself suddenly frightened of the youth before him. His words blasted the veteran campaigner like shards of ice. I already did when I left with you. My life's forfeit, as well as my soul, just like yours. Well, I'm not going to let them die alone. I'll die with them. Trim reared his horse up, terrifying the large animal that Ghost rode and hurling him into the mud. The half-elf spun his mount around and tore down the road back to Delmore as Ghost pulled himself up in a fury. I won't wait for you, half-breed. I'll leave you out there just like the others. You're a blind fool, Trem, and now a dead one as well. Wrath and Gend were staring at him from atop their mounts, and Ghost's rage boiled over. He struck the pony Gend was riding and roared, Take me to the caverns, halfling, unless you would like to die as well. Gend sputtered, Of course, Ghost. Yes, it's not too far. That is, if you're certain about Trem. The halfling turned, trying to soothe his mount, and began slogging south toward the caverns in deep thought. Ghost tried to wipe the mud from his armor, but found it too thick and clinging. He ignored the halfling's question angrily and looked up to see Wrath holding his horse's reins. The dark figure dropped them rather than handing them over, and the Napoleon reddened still further. But before he could erupt, Wrath whispered, Letting Trem Waterhound go is a grave mistake. Ghost was silent as he grasped his reins and heaved his sodden body onto Karok. Once he was situated, he eyed his now depleted band and sighed in frustration. Well, what else am I supposed to do? Tell me, what else can I do? Gend averted his eyes, but muttered, We could go back, too. Ghost almost exploded in anger, but somehow restrained himself. He glanced at his remaining followers again and knew they were right, but his pride would not allow him to turn back. We go to the caves. Gend looked up in shock, but Ghost did not let him interrupt. Now! We have wasted enough time already. He turned and started south again. Wrath and Gend exchanged a look, and the assassin shrugged indifferently, turning to follow. Gend watched him a moment and then looked down the road where Trem had gone, his eyes approaching something near panic. He looked both ways a few times before realizing he did not have the courage to return to Delmore or to disobey Ghost. Fearfully, he spurred his animal after the Napoleon and away from the coming battle. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop there, but I will pick up this second half of this chapter, as well as chapter 21 tomorrow. It should be no problem, and then we'll be on 22. You can follow me on @LegacyChronicle through Twitter. You can also send messages or questions through this Twitch channel, and you can also find these videos on YouTube under Vulture X21. There's a Legacy Chronicle video series that you can grab from there. Thanks for watching.